Okay, so today we're going to be talking about ethics in biomedical research. And so, of course, this topic is extremely large. I can see you're all master's students. So you've either started working on research, or you're going to continue or start writing your proposals. So I think the area of ethics in biomedical research is extremely important, especially when you are starting to design a new study. So if we're going to look at the key learning points from the topic that we're going to be discussing, is that, first of all, when you uphold a strict code of ethics while conducting scientific research, this is the foundation for building a good researcher. And research ethics are a group of moral principles that start with designing the study until you publish. And a good researcher must be aware of international regulatory bodies that govern the ethical conduction of research in her country and worldwide. So, of course, there are two sides of the coin. The first side is that in different countries and there are different regulatory bodies inside of institutions, which are called, for example, institutional ethics committees or institutional review boards, and they are actually the governing bodies that will tell you whether or not your study upholds ethical principles. The other side is the researcher. So let's agree that anyone who is working in the area of research relies totally and purely and almost 100% on honesty, because you will see, or maybe some of you have read, and we're going to talk about some issues of fraud now during this presentation or during this talk. So sometimes it can be easy for researchers to falsify data. So at the end, what governs us is our honesty and the knowledge that the information that we disseminate to the scientific community will then be taken by our governments and hopefully be upregulated to be disseminated over all humanity or over the public as well. So if any part of this information that we disseminate was not honest, this means that either a treatment might be incorrect for the patient, or we might be actually bringing harm on someone by applying these falsified data. So why do we worry about ethics? So first of all, can the data be trusted? So again, why should the data be trusted? Because, for example, an association such as, for example, the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA in the US, or for example, in Europe, you have the CE mark. Now, these institutions rely on data that has been obtained through scientific research. And what happens is, for example, when a drug is being developed in vitro research, what happens is that eventually this drug is going to be submitted to, for example, the institutional bodies such as the FDA or the CE or whatever, and they will start planning for trials in order to use this drug. Now, if the data cannot be trusted, this means that everything else will be based on false data. There is also an important thing, for example, for the treatment. You will find me mostly talking about things that are related more to the medical community or to treatment of patients, because this is the area where I'm more involved, of course, because I deal with patients every day. So what happens is these regulatory bodies then come up with statements, for example, such as the WHO or the World Health Organization. And they tell us that, for example, this disease or that disease has a higher percentage to occur in cases of, I don't know, this and this and this, or, for example, a certain virus can be transmitted via this route or that route or whatever. And so if all of this data is based on information that was dishonest, then everything else that applies to mankind will also be incorrect. So again, there are ethics committees, and the ethics committee actually comes in function from the beginning of designing your study. So for example, you have come up with a good idea for research, and you want to start implementing this research, whether this research is an animal experimentation or human experimentation. And so you submit a proposal to the Institutional Ethics Committee, and they start reviewing this proposal. And by the way, institutional ethics committees do not only contain or include individuals that are of the same scientific caliber, or of course, if your peers or the same scientific specialty, but they also must include someone with a legal background and also someone who is a layperson, so someone from the public, because it's very important that the study design that we apply for research must have translatable implications on the public as well. And someone from the normal public must be able to understand this research, especially if it includes a human study. Now, why are there ethics committees also specifically for animal studies and specifically for human studies? Because in animal studies, we must guarantee that these animals are being treated in a humane way, both from pain control, and later on we'll talk about the rules that govern animal studies, and up to how is the animal being sacrificed or euthanized or killed, because this also has regulations. How is the carcass of the animal being disposed of? All of these are things that enter underneath the title of ethics. If we go for human clinical trials, then the ethics committee must also approve something that's very important, which is the informed consent. Because any patient that will be enrolled in a clinical trial that you are doing, so there are different phases of clinical trials, and in any phase of a clinical trial, of course, clinical trials are at the top of the hierarchy of evidence-based research, topped only by systematic reviews and meta-analysis. So the very credible data comes out of randomized controlled clinical trials. And therefore, patients that join the randomized controlled clinical trials, besides having to fulfill specific inclusion and exclusion criteria, they must also sign an informed consent. Now, in the past, it would be okay to say, okay, I'm taking oral consent from the patient. But now the informed consent must be a written consent. And by the way, the patient has a right to read and understand everything that you write in the study, to understand all of the harms or the side effects that might happen. And the patient has the right to drop out of the study or leave the study at any time. And this is the code of ethics. Now, this is the second step. So first of all, you designed your study and you took the ethics approval. And then you applied for an ethics committee approval for specifically for your animal experimentation or for your human experimentation. And you have successfully completed the study. And by the way, for clinical trials, for example, in order to publish your data later on, you are required to register this clinical trial in one of the international registries or databases. For example, there is one with the WHO. There is one called clinicaltrials.gov, and this is part of the NIH, or the National Institutes of Health. And you must be able to register your clinical trial in a public registry. Now, this is available for everyone, even for a normal person, because when you conduct a clinical trial using human subjects, there should be transparency. Everyone should know what you are doing and should know the protocol that you are using. There are also some clinical trials which allow patients not only for you to recruit specific patients, but allow patients to come and apply for joining your clinical trial. Now, the last step is after you finished your study, you will want to publish. Now, if you're going to publish, now most of the journals, let's say even 99% of the journals, of course, journals that have good impact factor, that are properly indexed, that by well-known publishers, by good peer reviewers, and good editorial boards, they actually require an ethics statement. So if you have not had or obtained institutional ethics approval for your study, you will not be able to publish your study. And you must also have, so the institutional ethics committee usually has or should have an international number, so it should be registered worldwide, and it should have an international number where any one of us will go to, for example, the Alexandria University and find that Alexandria University has a number for its institutional review board for the faculty of X or the faculty of Y or the faculty of Z or whatever. The other important thing is the conflict of interest statement, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later on. What is the conflict of interest statement? And of course, you can see here, ethical violations, of course, adversely affect your scientific integrity. When you choose the path of research, the most important thing, so you will hear, of course, researchers talking about the H index, talking about how many articles they've published per year, and what's the impact factor of the journal, what's my H index, how many citations do I have. Now, if I'm not completely honest with what I document and publish, then my scientific integrity will be affected and my credibility will be affected, and the way that people cite me in their papers will also be affected. All right. Are you okay so far? Anyone want to ask anything? So are you following, or I seem to have lost you? Okay. All right. I just want to make sure that everything is okay. Okay. If you want to ask a question, let me know. If everything is clear and you already know this stuff, let me know. All right. Okay. So let's move forward. Okay. So the ethical principles of medical research, if we all remember, or for who of you are from a medical background, the Hippocratic Oath says, first of all, do no harm. And if we look at the Declaration of Helsinki that has been modified since 1948, which is the Physician's Pledge, this has been modified throughout the years, and actually it has been updated the last time at the General Assembly in Chicago in the United States in October 2017. And if we look at the sentence, it's very important. I will not use my medical knowledge to violate human rights and civil liberties, even under threat. So this is an extreme demonstration of how ethics in general are actually the general code that govern how we run our lives and how we work with medical research. So this is a definition of the ethic, of the word ethic in general. So this is the dictionary definition. And ethics is an area of study that deals with idea about what is good and what is bad. So if ethics is actually a very philosophical definition, and they are a group of moral and social values to uphold in life, but also in research, of course. And again, we should all agree on an international code of ethics. Good behavior is good behavior, bad behavior is bad behavior for everyone. It cannot be one thing in one country and another thing in another country. All right. So if we talk about research ethics, this is ethical conduct in research and the study of ethical conduct in research. So what is the responsible conduct of research? Following ethical and scientific standards and legal and institutional rules in the conduct of research. Now, there are governing bodies that also can provide legal investigations into cases of research misconduct. And so, for example, let me give you a brief example of research misconduct, although we're going to have a lot of examples later on. But one of the examples of research misconduct is, for example, so a group of researchers are working together in a specific research. So, for example, Yasmin, Adnan, and myself are working on a research study. And what happens is, in the middle of the research, so we've conducted a couple of experiments, and in the middle of the research, so we already started to design the study and we've performed the research. And what happens is, in the beginning, in the middle of the study, Yasmin wins a scholarship to travel to Germany to perform part of her own master thesis work, which is not related to this study. And in the meantime, myself and Adnan, we continue to do the research, and we do not inform Yasmin, although Yasmin did a part of the research, and we did not inform Yasmin that we're going to publish the work. And then we did not write Yasmin's name, but we put some of the experiments that Yasmin did in our paper. So what Yasmin can do is actually write. So first of all, let's agree that this is unethical, of course, for two reasons. Reason number one is we should have asked Yasmin to follow up with us with the work and write the document and write the publication, etc. And the second thing is that we left out her name, although she had substantially contributed to the work. Now, what Yasmin can do is say, I believe there is a violation of the regulations of responsible conduct of research, and she can send to the editor-in-chief of the journal saying that these co-authors left out my name, and so this is this violates the rules of responsible conduct of research. So this is just a simple example in the area of publication, and we're going to have other examples later on. If you look underneath the slides, you will see that there are, I'll be sharing the presentation with you later on, but there are links at the bottom. So whatever you need, all of the information has references at the bottom of the slides. Okay, so for me, in order to move forward and talk about ethics and how to uphold ethics in research, we first must talk about what are the qualities that you want in a good researcher. And if you look at the qualities of a good researcher, you will find number one is honesty. Because if you think about it, especially in the area of in vitro research, a table full of numbers with means and standard deviations can very simply be invented. So if we do not have honesty, or for example, as we all know, and we have worked in research, if you are conducting a study and you have, for example, a technical test or a technical assay, your golden number for replication is an N, or a number of experiments that is equal to 3. So you should be able to repeat this experiment or this data 3 times with similar means or similar behavior of the experiment. Now, a bad researcher or a dishonest person could, so for example, you have your mean, for example, is 45 and 43, but the third number, for example, is 78. And so a dishonest researcher could go and erase the number 78 and write 48, for example. So qualities of a good researcher start with honesty. Again, even your in vitro research, which is done in a petri dish, is then going to be upscaled to experimental animal work, small animals, large animals, and then eventually be applied to human research or human clinical trials, and then hopefully become commercially available as treatment or as drug or whatever kind of innovation that helps improve our lives. Because if we do not reach that point, then there's no use of us doing research. So again, honesty is the number one quality of a good researcher. Other than that, you have other things such as interest. So you must have interest, of course. You must seek to be recognized in a credible way in the scientific community. You must have severe, extreme commitment to your cause, to why you are doing research. So I always tell my students, when do you know that you want to be a researcher? When you have prioritized research over going out to see a movie with your friends, so when you have chosen to go check on your experimental animals at 10 o'clock in the evening, over, for example, staying at home and sleeping, this means that you are really, really committed to doing research. You need to be integrated within the scientific community. So if we are performing research without the final objective of disseminating the knowledge in the form of a publication, then we are wasting time. Because the important thing about research is that you actually share it with the scientific community, which is then, of course, shared with the public community. And so you are able to have some kind of implication on mankind. You need to have a scholarly approach. And of course, this is not the area for me to talk about today. I'm sure you all have a scholarly approach and systematic approach to how you perform research. You must also have inquisitiveness. So inquisitiveness is part of critical thinking. So how you think in a critical way about your problem, how you think outside the box, take all of the different information that you have and start reasoning with yourself using your critique skills. And that's why a very important part of my assessment for you in this course is how you critique the articles to understand how much you have gained from information or knowledge from the topic. Of course, you need to sacrifice and you need to be motivated all the time. And of course, you have to look for excelling in the field. We cannot be doing research to be mediocre. We want to be research because we want to be the best. In front of us is always to publish in Nature or Science. We might die before we do that, but it should always be our goal. And of course, it's very important to have a very wide knowledge base. Now, part of applying good ethics rules to research is reading a lot and having a lot of knowledge about the topic that you are going to be talking about. Because if you do not have sufficient knowledge, then, for example, when you are writing a review of literature of a specific topic, because you have not read sufficiently on this topic, or you have not performed a good survey of the literature, you might simply be selecting some papers and leaving out others because simply you didn't read enough. And if you are selecting a group, some information, and leaving out the other information, then you are not being ethical because you are actually directing the reader or the other researchers to only look in this area that you are giving them while neglecting the other part of the story. Okay. All right. So is everything okay now? I'm just not used to not having the students in front of me and seeing everyone. So I just want to make sure that everything is okay. If you think I'm too fast, let me know. If you think I'm too slow, also let me know. If there's some information that's already clear to you, I can move forward faster. All right. Okay. So Jean is asking, is ethical oversight during trial a requirement in every country? Yes, it should be. Even in Egypt, it has been so for the past, I think we have an institutional ethics committee present at the Faculty of Medicine, Alexandria University since 2005, at at the Faculty of Dentistry, where I am from. We have had it for around 5 years now. And before, in international journals, it was not required by all the journals to ask you to have a clinical trial registered. But now it is required. Now, when you submit for clinical trial registration, they actually ask you for the ethics committee approval. So this should be actually a rule in all countries. Is that clear, Jean? John? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. All right, okay. Anyone want to ask another question? Okay, so let's move forward. So before we move forward, how many of you have already actually been involved in research, whether in vitro research, experimental animal research, clinical trials? Okay, good. Excellent. So have you all published? All right. Not yet. Okay. So it looks like you're almost ready to start publishing. So I guess, okay, good, good. That's only 2 publications. That's great. Good, good. Very good. Excellent. All right. Very good. Very good. Okay. So since most of you have already performed research, I'm sure you are aware of most of what I'm saying. So maybe I can move forward a little bit more towards the area of publication ethics. All right. Okay. So let's talk about again other parts of research ethics. So first of all, fraud. Okay, so now we're starting to enter a little bit more into in depth. So what is research fraud? Okay, or publication fraud. So fraud means falsification of data or falsification of the experiments. So for example, you did an experiment, like we were saying before, you did an experiment and you modified in the results or in the data, or you manipulated the conditions of the experiment so that you obtain the results that you want. And that's a very important point in research. And I'm sure those of you who have conducted research know this, especially clinical research, which is called blinding. Blinding, which prevents bias. So, for example, the best way to perform research is to be blinded to the conditions that you are using. So for example, you have a specific drug or 2 or 3 different types of drugs that you want to test, for example, their cytotoxicity on the specific cell line, okay? And please let me know if this example is not clear for anyone. So I will just go back to my screen now, just so I can interact with you. One moment. Okay. Okay. So what you could do is, what you should do is, for example, I have drug number A, drug B, drug C, and for example, 2 of us are working in the lab, and I'm performing a cytotoxicity assay, for example, an MTT assay, to check the cytotoxicity of this drug, of these drugs on different cell lines. And I actually know which drugs I am placing. Now, although I might not intentionally be interfering with the data, but actually knowing which group or which drug I am putting may actually, for example, so I'm sure everyone is aware of, pipetting, etc., all this stuff, right? Cytotoxicity assays, of course. Now, so for example, I might be, so I know that I am more keen, so my hypothesis is more keen towards drug B. So when I am placing drug B, I might be more precise with the pipetting process than when I am with drug A or C. Now, mind you, this might not change really actually the results of the study, but it is some sort of bias. So the more accurate thing to do would be to have my colleague label, so not tell me who is drug A, who is drug B, who is drug C, but he knows. And then they gives me the conditions to put on the different plates or the different cell lines in a way that I am completely blinded to the conditions that I'm using. This is a way, if you have blinding, then this is a way of reducing bias. When you are reducing bias, this is a more ethical approach to your study. Now, fraud would be in different methods. So, for example, you have, like we said before, a number that you change, or for example, that you again manipulate the conditions of the experiment, or that the whole experiment you dump in the garbage and then you just make up the numbers. Now, this would be research fraud. Okay. Now, if we move forward, plagiarism. Now, I'm sure those of you who have written, who have actually starting to write or have written publications, you know what plagiarism is. Now, plagiarism is the act of how do you say, copying wording or research from someone else's work and not giving them appropriate credit and not rephrasing this work in my own words. And this would become clear later on. Animal abuse. It's very important. So animal abuse could be in many forms. Animal abuse, and I'll give you a specific example about how there are specific rules to govern animal experimentation. But animal abuse could be, for example, performing the experiment on too many animals. Or it could be neglecting to give the animal pain control after you do the experiment. Or it could be not killing or sacrificing the animal in a humane way. Or it could be in the conditions of living of the animal itself. This is called animal abuse. What about violation of human rights? So violation of human rights could also be that I didn't take informed consent from the patient, or that, for example, I performed a procedure without explaining it properly to the patient, or I performed the procedure that the patient did not need. And this is a very important thing. So it's important that when I am conducting a human clinical trial, it is important that the performing this trial, he knows the time required, he knows the side effects, he signs the consent, and he has the option to leave in at any time. I know this for a researcher is very frustrating that, for example, you might have 40 human subjects and 20 of them decide to leave the study. But however, this is his or her complete right. Inaccuracy. Now, inaccuracy might not be to the same level of fraud, but inaccuracy also implements the credibility of the data. Because again, if you are inaccurate, now research is extremely sensitive. If you are inaccurate, then this again means that when you upscale this work to experimentation, to human clinical trial, then these inaccurate documentations will then be translated the higher up as you go into the research. And so all of your final decisions or results will be based on inaccurate facts. Okay, citation bias and negligence. This is something that we maybe talked about slightly in the previous couple of slides, which is, for example, if you're writing a review of literature, and again you neglect to mention some of the papers, or citation bias. So, for example, Basma said she published 2 papers. Now Basma is writing her 3rd paper, and Basma chooses she wants to increase her citations and increase her H index, and so she selects the publications, her publications, to write them in the references, and she neglects to put others that have documented results that are opposite to hers. And so this is also a violation of research ethics, because she is directing ethics, she is directing the research to a specific area. Basma, I don't mean anything, I'm just giving an example. Okay, improper authorship, again, it's similar to the example we were talking about a little bit before, where we did not include Yasmin as a part of our authors, although she is one of the authors. And we'll talk about the authorship a little bit more forward. Okay. So when do research ethics apply? So, for example, let's take the example of an animal experimentation. So are you designing a study that will include experimental animal research? There are so many questions that so if you look underneath that, this is if you look at the reference, so one of them is from 2009, the other is from 1993, and this is a position statement. So position statements are usually done or announced by a group of very important scientists and important people. Also, they could be in the government, etc. But mainly they have a scientific background, and based on a lot of research and studying and scientific information, they sit down together in a committee and they decide a position statement. So all of us as researchers can follow this position statement. And so there are so many important things that you need to ask yourself when you are designing a study that will include experimental animal research. Number one, is the study justified? Is your hypothesis sound? So many of us will read a lot and start thinking and having ideas, but a very important point that we might fail to look at carefully is the justification of the study. Now, it's very important to always look at the translation or the implication of your study. If you are designing a study that is at the end not justified, or it will not find the end of the road to eventually to implement or to affect or to positively influence humankind or our lives, then we are wasting time. Now, this influence of mankind's life could be after 20 years, could be after 30 years, could be after 60 years, it doesn't matter. But it's important that when we select a study, that it is justified. And that's why it is very important to formulate a hypothesis. Now, you remember what a hypothesis is, right? So the hypothesis is the question or the research question that you are raising from out of your research, and it must be sound. And remember, you always have the null hypothesis and you have the alternative hypothesis. And you should always be mentioning the null hypothesis. Everyone knows how to formulate a null hypothesis, of course, right? Are you following me so far? All right, okay. So it's very important when we talk about the hypothesis is to remember to formulate the null hypothesis, okay? Because the null hypothesis is similar to the point of blinding. So the point that we were making before about blinding is that when you formulate a null hypothesis, you assume that there is no difference between the things that you are testing. This means you are entering your research without a risk for bias. But if you enter your research with a direction that you know that a specific drug will have a better effect than another one, then in some sort of way you are applying bias on your study. Now, the 3R rules. The 3R rules has actually been implemented recently. So there are countries that now really require the implementation of the 3R rules for animal experimentation. Do you know the 3R rules, or should I explain the 3R rules of conducting animal experimentation? So just briefly, excellent, very good. Refinement, replacement, and reduction, of course. So it's very, very important that you respect the 3R rules, where you have replacement alternatives. So when you are justifying your study, you should ask yourself, could I have used a different animal model, or am I just using this animal model because this is what the animal model that's available in my university? This is number one. So, for example, if you look at pain, if you are conducting an experimentation which has a response to pain, so for example, you should go seek the alternative of an animal, for example, that has a lower perception of pain. This is one example. Reduction means that you perform sample size estimation. Sample size estimation is now a prerequisite for any study. There is no need to perform an experimental animal study on 40 or 50 animals when you could have conducted the same experiment on 20 animals and obtained a good statistically sound result. So it's very important to perform sample size estimation in order, again, to have reduction rule. At the end is the refinement. Refinement is very important. So, for example, is your animal placed in a proper husbandry? Is the temperature correct? Is the humidity correct? Are the animals obtaining sufficient sunlight? Are you respecting the night and day or diurnal requirements of the animal? Is the animal being provided appropriate pain control after you finish your experiment? Are you performing euthanasia correctly? Are you giving the animal good sedation before you are killing the animal? Are you disposing of the animal carcass correctly in a way that you should dispose of biological waste? A very important part of designing experimental animal research is your pilot study. A pilot study or a feasibility study is a study that you perform using a few animals, very few animals. And the objective of the pilot study is to see, is the study actually feasible? Because it is useless for you to start or decide to conduct an entire experimental study when, if you perform the feasibility, you find it technically impossible. So, for example, let me give you an example from my work. So, for example, I want to test the effect of a material on the regeneration of bone at the area of the maxillary second molar. So very far, for example, in the mouth of a rabbit, inside, very deep inside the mouth of the rabbit. And when I actually came to perform the study, the technical feasibility of the study, I found that it is impossible to open the mouth of the animal and place the defect in that area. And so I have to change the model or the defect model that I'm using. If I had started registering my trial and started with the trial already without performing a pilot study, then I will have wasted many animals, wasted a lot of time. And of course, this is again a violation of ethics because it is not feasible to do this study. Another important thing is, are you following the hierarchy of use of experimental animals? Now, in each kind of research, there is the gold standard for the animal model. For example, for us in the dental field or in the area of regenerative medicine, the hierarchy usually starts with, working on mice, rats, rabbits, moving a little bit forward and working on sheep, goats, dogs. So, for example, in dentistry, a dog is one of the larger animal models. And then you move forward. If you have the luxury of working on monkeys, then you can work on monkeys or primates. And then you move forward to perform your clinical trial. You definitely cannot upscale experimental animal work that was done on mice and say, I'm going to perform a clinical trial tomorrow, because you must follow the hierarchy of use of experimental animals. And of course, you must select the proper animal model for the tissue and for the application that you are testing. And again, of course, like I was saying before, did you revise the anesthesia, analgesia, and euthanasia protocols? So, for example, if you are performing surgery in an animal and you're afraid that the animal will die, so we've all performed animal research and we've all had the fear that the animal will die because of an overdose of anesthesia. However, this does not justify that I give less than the appropriate dose and the animal begins to wake up during the procedure because I am afraid that the animal will die from over anesthesia. So it's very important that we remember these things when we are performing our animal study. Now, if we look at clinical trials and human research, now having been involved with human research, it's a long road. So studies including human participants, of course, you have to be submitted to the Institutional Ethical Board. You must submit, for example, it's a very long road. You have to have the ethics committee approval. You will have obstacles because you need to register your clinical trial. You will then have to get your informed participant consent, both oral and written consent. You have to have a sound hypothesis, estimate your sample size, and then at the end, you will be able to touch the patient and start performing your trial. We have an example. So we published a paper in 2016, which is based on a clinical trial that is registered at clinicaltrials.gov. If you would like to go and check the website and take a look of what the trial, the registered trial looks like, what the proposal or the protocol looks like, how outcome assessment is done, how you document your data after you finish the trial, please go ahead and check it out. Okay, so we'll move forward a little bit now to talk about publication ethics. And again, let me stop here to see if everyone is following. Okay. Any questions? Okay. So publication ethics. Now, I'm sure some of you have already published or you're working on a publication. Publication has become much, much more difficult than in the past 10 years. There are much more regulations. There are much more stringent rules to be applied. And in order to get an idea about what are the publication ethics that govern us as authors, now, so when you've conducted your research work, even if you've done a clinical trial, you are now shifting from the role of a researcher to the role of an author. So now you're becoming an author. Now, the Committee on Publication Ethics shows you a group of publication ethics. Actually, the Committee on Publication Ethics is a committee. You can actually talk to them. You can send them inquiries. You can actually complain to them about certain things. So allegations of misconduct can be submitted to the COPE, authorship and contributorship, complaints and appeals, conflict of interest, competing interest, data reproducibility, the ethical oversight, intellectual property. Another important thing is intellectual property rights. Maybe we didn't talk about it, but if you are conducting a work or a research in which there is the question of a patent, it's very, very important to have intellectual property rights discussed. Intellectual property rights will not only be yours alone as the researcher or the person involved directly with the patent, but if you are performing this research with the resources of your university and performing them on the grounds of the university, then the rules of the intellectual property right of your university will also apply. So your university will be part of this patent because you're doing the work in underneath the umbrella of your university. So intellectual property rights is very important to clarify, especially if you have patent issues. Journal management is something also that the Committee on Publication Ethics looks into. So the credentials of the editor-in-chief, how the editorial process happens, and also how peer reviewing processes take place. So peer review is, you all know that in respectable journals, you have a process of peer review that happens when you submit your paper. It is usually revised by 2 to 3 peer reviewers. Usually it is blinded, and then they reply to you and tell you about their comments in order that you can correct if needed, minor revision, major revision, or whatever. And then there is also the question of post-publication discussions and corrections. So, for example, some corrections are, let me give you an example of an error which might not be a violation of publication ethics, but it could be an error. For example, I wrote my name and incorrectly, or for example, the first author wrote the names of all the authors and incorrectly placed the order of the authors in an inappropriate manner by mistake. So in this case, you can also make an appeal to correct the order of the authors. Another thing could be if an affiliation was forgotten. You know what an affiliation is, of course. So many people work with more than one university or have more than one affiliation. So for example, one of these affiliations may have been mistakenly dropped out. And so again, the Committee on Publication Ethics can actually address some of these points. So if we're talking about publication ethics, why is it important to publish from the start? So to publish, you want to contribute to the overall body of knowledge. You want to get more citations, of course. You want to get grants and scholarships. And of course, publishing now has become a keystone of getting grants. You want to get promoted. You want to raise your H index. You want to be recognized in the scientific community and build a reputation. And of course, the overall goal that we want is to advance knowledge. So let's talk about specifically an example of citation bias. And what you need to do is to avoid citation bias is, again, have a lot of knowledge. You need to read, and read again. You need to critically assess the literature that you are citing. So critically assessing the literature starts with the journal, where this article was published. Who is the publisher? Who are the authors? Do they have a good track record? Are they well cited? How is the university that they're affiliated with? Are they well known? Is their lab, for example, known for this kind of research? All of these are important points to take into consideration before you start criticizing the paper. You cannot take a paper which is published in the Journal of Mad Rabbits and say this is a good article, even if the information inside it seems to you to be okay. It is very important to be able to critique the work. Now, so again, what is citation bias or negligence? This is a selective citation of research findings depending on the nature and direction of the results. So this might be an inadequate review or a singular point of review. So you did not read well, you did not overview entirely all of the literature, and so you selected some points to talk about and other points not to talk about, okay? Now, a very important part of citation bias is the following. And I'm not sure who does it or if maybe by mistake you've done it, but one example of citation bias is not to read the entire paper. So for example, you download the article and you see, so what you do is when you are searching for literature is that you go on one of the international databases, for example, PubMed or Google Scholar, and you look at the abstract. So you are searching for specific keywords using your Boolean characters, specific. So for example, you write, I don't know, stem cells and neural regeneration, for example. So you're looking for these specific words and you find a paper that fits your criteria of search. And you go and read the abstract. And you find that in the abstract, you have a nice wording of the results, nice wording of the conclusion. And so you just choose to cite what you read in the abstract. Now, this is a kind of citation bias, because what you read in the abstract is just 250 or 300 words that give you a very quick summary of the work. If you open the paper and read the whole thing, you might find that there are some points that are interconnected and related to each other that might change your interpretation of the data. So when you simply rely on the abstract, this means that you are neglecting, you are being biased to a specific point of, or a specific sentence that is written in the abstract. Another thing is, when you go and cite your work, so let me ask you this question. When you are citing work from a paper, all right, so you have the introduction section, you have materials and methods section, you have a results section, and you have a discussion section. So let me ask you, from which part do you cite your work? So you're taking this paper as a reference, okay? So for example, this is the paper by Thomas, and you're taking this paper as a reference. Which are the parts that you will use in your paper? So this is a question.